thank you for being here. I am Michael Cohen. I am the Stuart and Suzanne Grant Professor of the American Jewish Experience here at Tulane. And I am also Chair and Seisler Professor of the Department of Jewish Studies. And I am also, directing the Stuart and Suzanne Grant Center for the American Jewish Experience, which launched here in July. The center is a world-class hub of learning dedicated to the innovative study of American Jews, and that wouldn't be possible without the generosity of the Grant family and several other named and anonymous donors. So I want to begin by thanking you all, and thank you everybody for being here. So it's in my capacity as director of the Grant Center that I welcome you to our second public program. Last month, our own Golan Moskowitz moderated a panel featuring Jonathan Greenblatt, the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, for a conversation that was built around the ADL's new guide to anti-Semitism called Anti-Semitism Past and Present. And the panel also included historians Jonathan Sarna and Magda Teeter. And if you missed that discussion, you can view it on YouTube. We'll put the link in the chat. And our next event will feature our own Alana Horwitz, who will be leading and moderating a discussion with two of the nation's leading experts on contemporary Jewish life, Len Sachs of Brandeis and Ari Kelman of Stanford. And we will update the date on our website when it's confirmed, but we expect that to be in late November or mid-December. And for more information about who we are, what we do, and how you can help to support the Grant Center and our vision, please visit us at grantcenter.tulane.edu. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague and my friend, Dr. Pamela Nadell. And I just want to start by saying that bringing Pam to the Grant Center is a really special milestone for me. When I first came to Tulane 12 years ago, the first lecture that I organized was a lecture by Pam Nadell. So as we launch the Grant Center this year, it's really extra special for me to be able to introduce her. Professor Pamela Nadell holds the Patrick Clenenden Chair in Women's and Gender History at American University, where she directs the Jewish Studies program, and she received the university's highest award, Scholar Teacher of the Year. Very well-deserved award. Her books include Women Who Would Be Rabbis, A History of Women's Ordination, a past president of the Association for Jewish Studies and the recipient of the American Jewish Historical Society's Lee Max Friedman Award for Distinguished Service. Her consulting work is also for museums that include the National Museum of American Jewish History, as well as the Library of Congress. Her recent book, which we're here to talk about tonight, America's Jewish Women, a History from Colonial Times to Today, won the National Jewish Book Award Everett Family Foundation Jewish Book of the Year. The paperback edition was just published in May. Lastly, I just want to remind all of our guests tonight to submit questions via the chat function, and we will be able to get to questions later on in the webinar. So Pam, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Cohen. It's such an honor to have been invited to speak at Tulane University during this inaugural year of the Grant Center for the American Jewish Experience. As a former chair of the Academic Council of the American Jewish Historical Society, the scholarly body dedicated to studying America's Jews, I want to thank Stuart and Suzanne Grant for advancing our field of study with the Grant Center, and to thank all of the contributors. The grant's generosity will ensure that for many, many years ahead, research, writing, teaching on America's Jews will not only flourish, but grow from strength to strength. So it may feel a bit indulgent in this year of crisis to spend time thinking about the past. But as a historian, I know that what we learn about the past informs our present. So this evening, I will share with you some thoughts on more than 350 years of America's Jewish women, many of whom knew crises equal or greater to that of our own moment, but who persevered. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen, and there we are. And I want to do something a little bit unusual. I'm going to open with some family photos, and it's not so usual for faculty to do that, but I'm gonna do that. So I'm gonna show you this first one here. This photo is my great-grandmother, and I know that the photo was taken in the first decade of the 20th century. And what is striking about the photo, I find, are a couple of things. First of all, you can see that she's wearing a sheitel. If you can see my cursor, it's very clear that she's wearing a sheitel, the wig that a married Jewish woman who was observant would have worn then, and many observant Jewish women will continue to wear one down until today. And then what is also stunning about this is that the dress that she's wearing, one of my former students who's getting a PhD in apparel design told me about this. The dress that she's wearing went out of style in 1870. And so I always guessed that it was old-fashioned. Now I know it for sure. In this photo, you see her daughter, my grandmother. She's about 14 years old. It's taken at the same time, and she is, I like to think of it this way, she's very she. She's got a bow in her hair, she's got bows on her shoes, and I know that the dress that she's wearing was only in style between 1903 and 1910. It was called a linen or a lingerie dress. So in the next family photo, the woman with her back to us and is in a park on a warm spring day, and she's wearing a black pencil skirt and a white blouse, and it's my mother. And she says that's what she always wore back in those days in the 1950s. And if you look really carefully, you'll see a baby's bonnet peeking over her shoulder, and that's me. So I didn't bring a photo of me because you can see me, and I am wearing the classic garb of a female professor, a black jacket, which I would have been wearing if we were in person, or I'm wearing on Zoom. But in the next photo, you can see my daughter. And my daughter at this point is already an undergraduate or maybe even a postgraduate, and she's wearing the garb of a college student, right? She's got on tall boots, she's got on a short skirt, and she's taking a selfie. And I'm gonna come back to this, the point about the selfie. But when I asked her, can I use this photo in my talk? She said, sure, Mom, you can, but you have to tell them that the boots are yours. So I am. But what's stunning about these images and the way in which the clothing of the women in them changed is that just as their clothing changed, so had their lives changed. And it's what drew me into this book and into my story. My great-grandmother was one of some 2 million East European Jews who came to America at the turn of the 20th century. Her daughter, my grandmother, raised her children in the Great Depression. My mother came of age shortly after World War II. She had what I think of as a very typical experience for those years. She graduated high school, she had a little bit of college, she worked as a secretary, and then when the baby boom hit, she stayed home to raise her children. Then when it was time to go back to work, while she entered the workforce again as a secretary, or what today we would call an administrative assistant, she quickly pivoted and actually became a real estate agent and worked until her 80s. I rode the coattails of a revolution I did not make that brought me into the university and into my position as a professor. And my daughter, who is now in medical school, is riding the same coattails of that revolution, because had that revolution not occurred, and we're going to talk about it, neither I nor she would have had the opportunity to have the career ambitions that we ultimately had. So these images, and they hang on the walls of my house, and they're perched atop countertops. They've guided me into this history as I began to ask questions. I wanted to know what was different about the lives that these women led. What was different about the way they raised their families? What about the kind of work they did? What about where they lived, or where they were not allowed to live? I wanted to know what was different about their marriages. I had questions about how they raised their children. I definitely wanted to know what about the games that they played. I mean, one of my questions was, when did Mahjong become a Jewish woman's game? And I can tell you it was the 1920s. But most of all, I also wanted to know how technology had transformed their lives. I don't know if we were in person, I would ask you what is going on in this photo. This is from the second decade of the 20th century. It's actually used in the National Museum of American Jewish History. And this woman is doing laundry. She's in a tenement. Definitely the photo is posed. She's actually dressed too well for somebody who would have been doing laundry. And she's lucky because has these taps over here so she could fill that big tub with water, but she's got to heat that tub on the stove. And I don't know about you, but I don't really like doing laundry. And I want you to think for a minute about what life was like for women before there were electric washing machines. So she has to fill that tub. She has to boil the water. She has to dump the clothes in. Then she's got to wash them, wring them out, haul that wet laundry up to the roof, hang it out to dry, hope it's not going to rain, haul it back down, and then if it needed, she would also have to iron it. Doing laundry and housework and the kinds of technological changes that happened to shape women's lives affected not only the women in my family, but women across American history. And it becomes one of my major themes as well. But most of all, what I wanted to know was what it meant to these women to be Jewish women. Because the women in my family are Jewish, and the women in my stories are Jewish, and I think of Jewishness and Judaism as running in kind of three parallel tracks. You have one track where there's a group of America's Jewish women who center Judaism at the core of their lives. They move from Sabbath to Sabbath, from holiday to holiday. They shop at a kosher butcher. They live within a Jewish world. Their activities, their friends, Judaism's really governing their experience. There's an entire huge swath of America's Jewish women for whom Jewishness is critical. It determined who they married, how much education they got, the games that they played. But they don't move from Sabbath to Sabbath, from holiday to holiday. And then there's a cohort of America's Jewish women across the ages for whom being Jewish was incidental, not very important. But every once in a while, they would bump up against someone who reminded them that it was very important that they were Jewish. So I think this sampler says it all. If you think you can be a little bit Jewish, you think you can be a little bit pregnant. Two women are going to take us into our story. The first is Grace Nathan, Grace Mendes-Seiches Nathan. You can see from her dates, if you know your history, and I hope the students who are watching do, you can see from her dates that she was born in time to live through the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence, the ratification of the Constitution, even the War of 1812. But when she writes her letters that she left us in the archives, what does she talk about? She writes about a niece who has been spitting up blood for several weeks, but the doctors are not terribly worried because they think her corsets are too tight. Clothing matters. Now this woman, you may know, Emma Lazarus. Emma Lazarus, of course, is the famed poet whose words are inscribed in the base of the Statue of Liberty, welcoming the huddled masses yearning to breathe free to America. What you probably don't know is that Emma Lazarus was Grace Nathan's great-granddaughter. And they had very different lives. Grace Nathan was a sister, a daughter, a wife, a mother, a grandmother, and a widow. Emma Lazarus never married, never bore a child, but won such acclaim that her name has so often been in the news in connection to discussions about immigration that sometimes I think people think she's still alive. But both of them were shaped by three powerful forces in their lives. They were women, which meant they were constrained by the social conventions of their era. They were Americans, which meant that they regaled in the liberties America offered them. And they were Jews. And they used America's liberty to defy some of the social conventions about what women should do in reference to Judaism in their era. So let me give you a sense of what I mean. Emma Lazarus wrote a poem called In Exile, where she imagined her ancestors trudging out of Spain and coming to this new land that gave them the freedom, and I quote, to follow Moses's law and to think the thoughts Spinoza taught. Now, for those of you who have heard of Benedict de Spinoza, you may know that he was a 17th century Dutch Jewish philosopher whose views on biblical criticism were so heretical that the Jewish community excommunicated him. They kicked him out of the community. For Emma Lazarus to claim Spinoza's ideas was very radical. It showed her as an activist and a change maker in Judaism. The even more striking thing is her very traditional great-grandmother did something similar. At the end of her life, Grace Nathan wrote an ethical will to her only son, Naphtali. And an ethical will is a document that one uses to transmit one's life's lessons. And in the ethical will that she wrote, she said, "At my death, only keep your beard for 7 days." Those of you who know Jewish tradition, and Grace Nathan certainly did, she was a pious Jewish woman, know that Jewish men typically do not shave following the death of a parent for a minimum of 30 days, if not for an entire year. So she was a Jewish change maker. She was changing Jewish law for her son. So I'm going to go back a little bit now, and 35 years after the first Jews landed in the New World, in New Amsterdam, a half a century before Grace Nathan was born, Abigail Levy was born in London, and you can see her here in a beautiful portrait of her. When she was 7, her family set sail for New York. And when she was 16, she married Jacob. Jacob Franks was 24 years old. In many states today, a marriage between a 24-year-old and a 16-year-old would be considered illegal. But in the colonial period, a man had to be much older than his bride because he had to be able to support her and the family that would soon follow. Abigail Levy Franks bore 9 children. 2 of them died young. That was not the record for a colonial era Jewish woman. The record for the number of children was held by Rebecca Machado Phillips in Philadelphia. She had 21 children, and one wit quipped that she almost ran out of biblical names to give them. The reason we know so much about Abigail is that she wrote a treasure trove of letters to her eldest son. Jacob and Abigail sent him to England when he was in his late teens. There he settled with Jacob's brother, his uncle, and he helped in the family's international trade. And Abigail was a pious Jewish woman. We know this from the letters because the letters that she wrote to him, he saved, and they were eventually published. And in one of the letters, she says to him, "Never eat anything except for bread or butter at your uncle's house." Why? Because she didn't trust her sister-in-law to keep a kosher kitchen. Now, for sure, her son didn't listen because he married his cousin, his uncle's daughter, and he must have eaten many meals in that house. But we also see in one of the letters, Abigail's inclination already to change Judaism. And it's a striking quotation. She says that if it were up to her, that if only a Calvin or a Luther would rise amongst us, she would be one of the first of their followers. So imagine this, a pious Jewish woman in the 18th century saying that she wants a reformer like the Protestant reformers, John Calvin and Martin Luther, to come and reform Judaism. And she says this because she says she is sick of Judaism's idol ceremonies and senseless superstitions. So we see already in the colonial era that Jewish women are going to play powerful roles in shaping American Judaism. I should add that Abigail also paid the price of some of those impulses. When her daughter Phila intermarried with the Protestant Huguenot Oliver de Lancey, Abigail's spirit was crushed. And she said that she never wanted to speak to anyone again. And we have no idea if she ever actually reconciled with Phila. We know we have a letter from Jacob where he's trying to get Abigail to reconcile with her daughter. So another major theme of the American Jewish experience, reacting to intermarriage, already has emerged. Now I'm going to leave behind the colonial world of Abigail, move beyond Grace Nathan's period of the early Republic and Emma Lazarus's brief life, and I'm going to turn to this woman, Rosa Sonnenschein. Rosa Sonnenschein came to America from Moravia in Central Europe. She came to St. Louis in the 1860s. And she came with her husband, who was a rabbi. He became the rabbi of the leading congregation, Reformed congregation in St. Louis. And as a rabbi's wife, she did the kinds of things that rabbis' wives do. She gave birth to the fourth of her 4 children, so family size has gotten smaller in the 1860s when they landed there. She was active in the synagogue. She did something that I really love, I personally love. She created in 1879 a group called the Pioneers, and we historians think it was the first Jewish women's book club in the United States. And the more amazing thing is, it is still going strong today. But she was a maverick, not only in terms of founding such an important organization, she was a maverick in another way, because in 1892, she walked out on her husband. Now, if you know anything about divorce laws, and we've got any divorce lawyers on here, in the 19th century, and actually in New York State until 1964, if you wanted to get divorced, you needed grounds to get divorced. By walking out on her husband, she gave him grounds to divorce her. As she later told her grandson, she wanted to be rid of him, not ruin him. And so now she's stuck. She's not going to be able to collect alimony. She has to earn a living. And so she founded the first English language Jewish women's magazine in America, and she called it the American Jewess. The term Jewess is often seen in the contemporary setting as kind of sardonic. It's not in this era, today it might be, but in this era, it was what Jewish women called themselves and were called by others. And in this magazine, she writes of this moment of transformation in American Jewish life. She writes about the first of the great powerhouse Jewish women's organizations, the National Council of Jewish Women. And these are also the years, although it's a little bit after the American Jewess ceases publication, these are also the years of Hadassah, of the synagogue sisterhoods. And I wondered, what's going on? Why are these organizations emerging now, these great national Jewish organizations that still exist today? And I think the explanation has to do, again, with transformations in American women's lives. In 1800, the average white woman in America, I'm not saying all Jews are white, but I am saying that's the comparison group at this point. The average white woman in America had 7 children. By 1900, she is 3.5. In 1850, life expectancy for a white woman in America was under 40 years. By 1920, it had increased to 57 years. What happened? There are scientific advances that I don't have time to go into, but what it means is that women are living longer, spending less time childbearing and child rearing, and now they can give back to their community. So the National Council of Jewish Women, founded in 1893, adopts a political project to fight against white slavery, the institution of international prostitution that in these years of tremendous migration across Europe and to America, women and girls traveling on their own would get trapped into false marriages or raped and be sent to brothels in Buenos Aires and Istanbul. And they set out to protect especially Jewish women, but all women from that terrible fate. These are the years when Hadassah was established in 1912. In 1913, it sent 2 nurses to Jerusalem. They hung out the sign that you can see on your screen. It appears both in Hebrew and in English. And they saw 5,000 patients their first year. But we don't only need powerhouse women's organizations for Jewish women to be activists. In 1902, when the price of kosher meat on the Lower East Side of New York soared from 12 cents a pound to 18 cents a pound. I know the number seems odd by today, but it is a huge increase. Women who couldn't afford to feed their families gathered together in the streets, launched a kosher meat boycott. They broke into butcher shops. They took the meat, they threw it into the street, they doused it with kerosene so nobody could eat it, and sometimes they even set it aflame. As one woman who got arrested told the judge, she said, "We're not rioting, only see how thin our children are." Jewish women were also powerful activists as individuals. Nurse Lillian Wald, who had won a reputation for creating the Henry Street settlement, when the Spanish flu broke out in 1918, she was put in charge of all of the Nurses Emergency Committee in New York. And you can see here the bill that she had printed up at a Lower East Side print shop. She managed to get people to hand it out on a Sunday, standing outside. She actually says this in her memoirs, standing outside Lord and Taylor's in New York City. And they came by the droves to volunteer to help. These are also the years since we've just passed the anniversary of the suffrage amendment. These are also the years when Jewish women were active as suffragists. Here we see Sophia Lobinger, who called herself a suffragette, modeled on the activist women of the suffrage movement in Great Britain. And if you just look at the crowd around her, you can imagine the courage it took to climb atop a stepladder and speak to a crowd of men, asking them to give women the vote. But I'm curious also in these years about what's going on in the home, because we have Jewish women as activists, but what about being activists in the home? This next story comes from one of my all-time favorite books, Kate Simon's Bronx Primitive. Kate Simon was a travel writer. She wrote 3 volumes of evocative memoirs, and she describes what happens in her house, her apartment in the Bronx, every Sabbath Eve. Her mother, on Fridays, would make gefilte fish and polish the furniture with lemon oil. Then, as the Sabbath would descend, her mother would cover her head as a pious Jewish woman would. She would light the candles. She would begin to bless them. And one Sabbath Eve, in the middle of the prayer, her mother stopped, blew out the candles, tore off the headcloth, and as Kate Simon wrote, she turned to her astonished family and said, "No more. I never believed in it, and my mother's not here to make me do it." And according to Kate Simon, her mother never again lit Sabbath candles, but the house still smelled of gefilte fish and lemon polish on the eve of the Sabbath. So we see Jewish women reinventing traditions in America just the way Grace Nathan had. Jewish women in America also faced anti-Semitism. And I have so many examples of that. I can only give you one. Maybe some of you have heard of Edna Ferber. She was a Pulitzer Prize winning writer. She wrote Showboat, she wrote Giant, and they were made into films. And she describes a moment in the early 1930s, not long after Hitler has come to power. She's been invited to a soiree that an industrialist is hosting at his country house somewhere in the woods of Michigan. And during this dinner, the host starts talking about money-grubbing Jews controlling the world. And she watches as everyone around the table begins to agree with their host. She's so shocked that she stands up and says, "I am a Jew." And they look at her with such hatred that she says that when she went to her room that evening, because they all had to stay over at the country house, not only did she lock the door, she put a chair against it. So we see Jewish women as activists standing up for Zionism, standing up to benefit women from sexual harassment, sexual misconduct, and we see them also combating anti-Semitism. When I go to the period after World War II, the images of Jewish women and the amount of information I had when I was thinking about what to include in this book, it explodes. So I'm just going to share a couple of headlines with you. Bronx girl, 21, wins Miss America, Bess Meyerson. If we were together and I could see you, I would actually make you guess the answers to these. This one, $64,000 boxing quiz champ. This one, let's see. This Case of the Teenage Doll. Ruth Handler was the inventor of Barbie. This is not a headline, but there was a song in 1960 called "Will You Love Me Tomorrow?" It was written by Carole King and Jerry Goffin. It was sung by the Shirelles. And this is Carole King and Jerry Goffin on their wedding day. Why are they getting married? She is pregnant. What is the choice that a woman has in the 1950s if she finds herself pregnant? She could have a very illegal abortion where she risks dying, and the abortionist, even if he was a physician, risks going to jail. She could go away, have the baby, and give up the baby for adoption. I actually have a few cases of Jewish women who did that. By and large, that was much more common for Catholic women. Or she could either marry the father or find someone to marry her. So Carole King got married. And my last image from this early period, the 50s into the early 60s, Betty Friedan, the author of The Feminine Mystique. So my question is, why am I showing you these 5 images? These women are very, very different women. They all had their names in the news, and they were all Jewish women. And the fact that they were in the news in the 50s and the early 60s belies this image that also comes from the National Museum of American Jewish History. This is what we think of when we think of the 50s. We think of the mothers giving birth to the baby boom and pushing the baby boom into the future. Of course, those mothers who were pushing those baby carriages had an awful lot of time to think. And if they weren't thinking about how complicated the 50s were, they were going to help make the revolution that came of age in the 60s. So I want to give you just 3 examples that show how complicated the 50s were for America's Jewish women. This woman, Luba Bott, survived Auschwitz. She came to America in the late 1940s. She was a nurse in Poland, and miraculously, her records of her nursing experience, nursing school records, survived, and she was able to learn English, pass a nursing exam, and practice as a nurse in America. But what's striking is 2 weeks after she got to America, one of her aunts turned to her and said, "I want you to tell me what happened, and then I don't want you ever, ever to speak of it again." So Luba Bott, a Holocaust survivor, told her of surviving the ghetto, of lying to the Gestapo as they whipped her. They said she was a Jew. She kept saying, "I'm not a Jew." So they sent her to Auschwitz, but not as a Jew, which she was, but as a Polish political prisoner. And then of surviving Auschwitz and eventually having a chance encounter with her uncle, Sidney Hillman, a very important American labor leader after the war, who arranged for her to come to America. Another way in which the 50s were very complicated and included different kinds of Jewish women were the communists. And the execution of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg in 1953 sent a Cold War chill across the American Jews, men and women, for whom politics of the left had been their passion for decades. And then also in these years, we begin to see LGBTQ activists like Jerry Fayer coming out. And we tend to think of this only happening after Stonewall, but it didn't. Jerry Fayer left her husband and her children and went to hang out in the subterranean lesbian clubs of Greenwich Village. So when we start to move to the 60s, here's what I begin to think of. First of all, huge technological change, right? TV dinners, frozen TV dinners were created in the 1950s. They were supposed to make women's lives so much easier. Maybe they did, I'm not so sure, but what really made women's lives easier was the invention of the birth control pill. For the first time ever, women could control their reproductive lives. And so we begin to see enormous changes in the years ahead. When you think of the 60s, you might think of these images, but when I'm thinking about America's Jewish women and the 60s, I think of these images. Jewish women were disproportionately in the forefront of the feminist movement of the 1960s. That's the revolution whose coattails I rode. I didn't make the revolution. There are so many examples, and I don't have time to give them all to you, but let me suggest a couple. In 1964, the United States passed the U.S. Civil Rights Act. It prohibited discrimination in employment on the basis not only of race, but also of sex. A Jewish woman named Sonia Pressman, who had been a refugee from Nazi Germany, had become a lawyer in America. She got hired by the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, which was established to enforce this Title VII that prohibited employment discrimination. So she's working at the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, and she's watching the complaints come in. A third of the complaints are about sex discrimination. 2/3 are about racial discrimination in employment. But the lawyers who are choosing which complaints to act on are only choosing the complaints about racial discrimination. So she turned to Betty Friedan and she said to her, we meaning American women, need our own civil rights organization, and they founded the National Organization for Women. 12% of its founding members were Jewish women at a time when Jews made up about 3% of the population of the United States. Another Jewish woman, Gerda Lerner, a refugee from Nazi-occupied Vienna, became the first woman in America to get a PhD on a women's topic, not on a Jewish women's topic. She was a Jewish woman. But in the 1960s, she helped to launch, I don't know if she was the first woman ever to get a PhD in the field, but certainly the most powerful. She helped to launch the writing of women's history, both in America and actually also internationally. In 1970s, she began lobbying the government of her adopted country to create a Women's History Week. Today, we have Women's History Month. So we see in the wake of this revolution, these enormous transformations, these enormous changes. As the late and beloved Ruth Bader Ginsburg used to say, what is the difference between a Supreme Court justice and a bookkeeper in the Lower East Side? And her answer was 1 generation, because her mother was that bookkeeper. Of course, this dramatically impacted American Judaism. Many of you have probably seen in synagogues photos like this of American Jewish young women and their rabbi at their confirmations. May not have seen this particular photo, though, which comes from the East Midwood Jewish Center, because the woman sitting here to the rabbi's right, to our left, is Ruth Bader, or later, of course, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And this is her confirmation ceremony, not her confirmation hearings. I don't have time to go, maybe in the Q&A we can, into all of these dramatic changes, but let me give you a sense of what the world looks like now. Judaism transformed in many sectors by women being included in prayer rituals in ways that they never would have been before. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see. And I want to kind of sum up and then also tell one closing story. So in this very short time together, we have met Jewish women who centered Judaism at the core of their lives. Women like Grace Nathan, for example. We've met women for whom Jewishness was very powerful, so powerful that Hannah Solomon, who you saw in the photo of the National Council of Jewish Women, created a nationwide mass-based women's organization to take the principles of what it meant to be a Jew and to apply them to problems in society. And we also met a woman like Edna Ferber, for whom being a Jew was inconsequential until a group of people around her reminded her that it was very consequential. So I want to close with another pair of letter writers. So some of you may remember this. In the 1970s and the 1980s, during the movement to free Soviet Jews, when boys and girls would have their bar and bat mitzvahs, on Sabbath morning, they would be twinned with a Soviet Jewish teenager who couldn't have a bar or bat mitzvah. So I was working in the archives and I found a letter from a teenager in North Miami Beach written in 1982. And she wrote her Soviet twin and she said, "Did you get the stationery that I sent you and the letters that I sent you?" So I did what any good historian today does. I went on Facebook looking for the Soviet twin, and I found the Soviet twin, Kira Vovolsky, living in Jerusalem, where, by the way, she's become a web designer. And I said, "So did you ever get those letters from this American twin?" And Kira Vovolsky said she really didn't remember getting any letters from her. And so my next question was, well, are you by any chance Facebook friends? And she said no, that she and Sheryl Sandberg, who is COO of Facebook and who was Kira Vovolsky's American twin, are not Facebook friends, but her father and Sandberg's mother are. And I think it's a great place to close because it's with another pair of letter writers, and it was on the backs of so many letters that I was able to write this book. So thank you. Mike, questions?
Great, thank you, Pam. That was fantastic. I want to remind everybody that if you have any questions, please put them in the chat window, and we'll do our best to to work through some of those questions. I'll start, Pam. I want to ask you a few things. First, in your book, you recognize that what it means to be Jewish varies enormously. You mention, the religiously observant, the fiercely secular, immigrants, businesswomen, matrons, rabbis. Are there other categories in your book that you had to leave out?
There's an enormous category that I had to leave out, and that is essentially culture. In fact, when the book got reviewed in the New York Times, unfortunately, phew, it was a good review. The reviewers said, I only gave Barbra Streisand one sentence. And so I thought, well, either you give Barbra Streisand an entire book or you give her one sentence. And that was a conscious decision, not about the one sentence to Streisand, but the breadth of Jewish women and their cultural contributions. Part of the issue was that the original manuscript for this book was twice as long, and I knew, and it could have been much longer, I knew if I wanted anybody to read it that I needed to make really hard cuts. But it's also, Jewish women's contributions to American culture are enormous. when you think of everything from film, television, music, literature, both high literature and popular literature, there was just no way to get it all in. So that was a difficult decision, and hopefully somebody else will write that book.
Sorry, I muted myself accidentally. So, okay, so you go from what, I know in early conversations, people had told you that it was going to be impossible to write this book. And then you go to a manuscript that is twice as long as it has to be. Can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you faced, both in getting to the process of saying, okay, I can write this book, and then, okay, now how do I narrow it down?
Right. So the day I finished this book, the day you know as well as I do how hard it is to push send, right? Used to be it went in the mailbox, but now you sit there and you go, am I going to send it? Can I send it? So the day I had to send it to meet my deadline for my editor, my daughter posted on Instagram a photo of the two of us. I was much younger and she was 4. She was by then in medical school. And she said, my mom finally did it. She finished the book. I worked on this book on and off, I think for almost my entire life. From the moment I became a professor, I said, I want to write a book about America's Jewish women. And it took, so I would stop and I would start and I would think about it. But it took a couple of things to happen to enable me to really write this book. The first was that we needed several decades of scholarship in American women's history. And that scholarship begins in the 1980s in a serious fashion. It's scarcely emerged before then. And so I needed the underpinnings of that. I needed to know things like family size, work patterns, political involvements, because I couldn't fit America's Jewish women into that story unless I knew that story. Then I also needed the great scholarship of our colleagues. And serious scholarship on America's Jewish women does not begin to get written until the 90s. In the early 2000s, I edited a collection of articles on American Jewish women's history, and with one exception, the earliest articles were the 90s or into the early 2000s. So it took to create a kind of big history like this, you really need a lot of scholarship under your belt. And then, of course, I did a lot of primary research because I didn't want to tell the same stories that everybody else had told. So a lot of challenges.
Thanks. We have a few questions that are coming in, excuse me, through the chat. One question, the role of Jewish women seems crucial in the development of immigrant aid organizations with figures like Cecilia Rozovsky and the JDC. Has that commitment to immigrant aid remained a primary cause of Jewish women?
I think so. And first of all, thank you. It's a great question. And it's wonderful to hear Cecilia Rozovsky's name, who of course was at one point the representative from the National Council of Jewish Women at Ellis Island, and then did tremendous immigrant aid work in the 1930s, refugee work in the 1930s. Because America's Jews remain the majority of America's Jews remain wedded to liberal political causes, we do find lots of America's Jewish women who are involved in immigrant relief work now, on the borders, in their communities, in whatever ways that they can do so. And the Jewish women's organizations have remained committed to these causes as well. So I do think there's a nice through thread there, but nobody's really traced it historically. It would be interesting to look at to see what happens.
Great. Another question. You answered part of this question, I think, as you were answering the last question, but I'll ask the full question. How long did it take you to write the book? And follow up is, are you writing a history of Jewish women during coronavirus, during the COVID?
Well, thank you for the questions. So I worked on this book on and off for a long time. I think the actual writing of what became this book, or the draft that was too long and then I cut it down, probably took place over 5 or 6 years. And at that time, I was actually also chair of the history department. And so I was able to do some work on it. And then I had a period where afterwards I wasn't chair. And then, so I was able to finish it and to get it into the manuscript into the shape that I got it into. I'm not writing about Jewish women and COVID right now. It's too contemporary, doesn't feel historical. What I'm actually writing about now is I'm writing about women and gender and anti-Semitism. And that is really in the forefront of, I finished this book in 2018, so it's been a couple of years, and I gave you one story in the remarks about Edna Ferber, and that does appear in the book, but I am really struck by what kinds of gender differences there were about the way Jewish women experienced anti-Semitism and reacted to anti-Semitism. And I don't have all the answers yet, but I will tell you that one of the powerful ways they experience anti-Semitism is through their children, and the pain that they experience seeing their children facing either limitations in terms of their educational opportunities, or even not being able to go on a vacation with a friend, as one woman was writing in 1942 in a popular magazine. So that's where I am right now.
Thanks. Next question. What woman has had the biggest impact on you personally? And who was the most unexpected historical woman you came across?
So biggest impact on me personally. It's not a historical figure. I mean, you mean, so like from, maybe I should say, I mean, obviously I would say my mother, right? So I'm not going to answer that way. I think I'll answer it the way, who have I come to really admire in what I wrote, and what really stands out for me are some of the women who were very powerful activists during the feminist movement, whose names are just not as well known as a Ruth Bader Ginsburg or a Betty Friedan or a Bella Abzug, for example, who was Congresswoman from New York for 3 terms and who ran for the Senate. There's a woman that I wrote about named Heather Booth, who I've actually had the opportunity to meet, who when she was a college student at the University of Chicago in the 1960s, and a friend needed to get an abortion, and they were of course illegal, she founded a network called Jane that gathered college students, clergy, and helped women get as safe as possible abortions. And that organization helped 10,000 women before abortion became legal with Roe v. Wade. So I really admire her, and she's had a lifelong career as a public activist, but she's not a name that's particularly well known. So I think those kinds of stories, uncovering those stories, had a really large impact on me.
Great. So you mentioned to the necessary, how the field had to develop before you could really write this book, but you also mentioned that you filled it in with a lot of really good and interesting stuff. What were some of the favorite archival documents that you found? And if you give us a little bit sort of a story of maybe how you find the needle in the haystack and how that kind of unlocks a new part of the story.
Right. I would say that it's not so much the archival finds as it is the archival finds that connect to how you tell the story. So I'll give you an example. And one of my favorite finds was the Sheryl Sandberg story. Finding Sheryl Sandberg writing a letter, to her twin. And what I didn't mention in the remarks is Sheryl Sandberg writes in her letter that she likes to collect stationery. And if I ever met Sheryl Sandberg, I would love to ask her, do you still collect stationery? But one of it was it was what to choose. So for example, Luba Bott was Sidney Hillman's niece and Bessie Hillman's niece. And Bessie Hillman was a very important labor leader in Chicago, one of the founders of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America. And she is one of my protagonists in the chapter on the labor movement and on the Lower East Side period. And I knew I wanted to tell a story about a refugee who came to America, a Holocaust survivor who came to America after the war. There are thousands and thousands of stories and books that I could have used, but to find the story of her niece makes a powerful connection. So it was very much, and Lubabot left 2 volumes of unpublished memoir at the Yad Vashem archives. So I discovered that, I discovered her, and then I managed to track that down. And people have not written about Lubabot. One person's written about Bessie Hillman has. So I was able to, you know, bring forward a story to light that hadn't been brought forward before. So it was very much more conscious about how I'm going to shape this manuscript, how I was going to shape this book so that it made sense, because there were in the former version and the longer version, there were so many names that it just would have been completely overwhelming. Nobody would have been able to follow.
Great, thanks. Another question we have, what do you know about women in college admissions in terms of anti-Semitism? Stories we've heard pertain to men trying to get into Harvard, Yale, and the like. What about women's colleges? Did they readily admit Jewish women in comparison?
The answer is no. But I will fill it in, but the answer is no. We know what happened at the men's colleges. There have been actually 2 books have been written about, and more than 2 books have been written about the discriminations, the quotas that Jewish men faced starting in the late teens, running through the 20s, and then all the way into the 60s at Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. There was a group of women's colleges. I don't think they're called this any longer because they're not all women, but in those days they were called the Seven Sisters. Included Radcliffe, Wellesley, Smith, Bryn Mawr, Barnard. I've left out 2. And historians who have written about restrictive admissions in the universities have said that at the Seven Sisters by the 1940s, everybody knew that they were restricted. And but what's interesting is that you see those restrictions percolating out. And so they percolated out to what was called New Jersey College for Women, which eventually became Douglas College, which eventually became a state university, but started out in 19 as a public-private enterprise. And the dean at Douglas College, her name was Mabel Douglas, so they eventually named the school for her. She actually wrote that she was not doing interviews, but too many of the wrong kind of students were getting into her college. And so we can see that she starts interviewing, and in 1930, 61% of the Christian students, because the admissions office tracked by religion, 61% of the Christian students get admitted, 31% of the Jewish students who applied get admitted to the school. And we've got other material that shows outright discrimination. But I want to add something, because you asked about colleges, but you didn't ask about secretarial schools. And remember, most Jewish women are not going to college in these years, but if they're going out to work, and they are at least before they get married, they need certain kinds of secretarial skills. And the Catherine Gibbs Secretarial School, which was sort of the grand lady of all of them, they wrote a letter to a young woman named Pearl Cohn in Manchester, New Hampshire, and she'd written them asking for a catalog, and they wrote back and they said, "We don't admit Jews." I mean, point blank, just like that. We don't admit Jews. So we see discrimination, we see Jewish women facing discrimination that actually, just as it steered Jewish men in new directions, it also steered Jewish women in different directions. It cut off their opportunities.
Thanks. Another broader question, how do you see the field of American Jewish Studies changing as a result of this book? This book is such an important volume. It won the National Jewish Book Award. It is so highly respected in our field, and we're all reading it. How do you hope that the field moves in response to this?
Well, first of all, thank you. That was really nice. I'd say that I don't, you know, when you write a synthesis, even though it has lots of original material. But when you write a synthesis, you don't always know if it will move the field. And it's too early, I think, to necessarily see that. But of course, I hope that people will spin off from some of the ideas and some of the arguments that I've made. But I would also say that I hope that writing for a wider audience, writing a book that could be read beyond our colleagues, I hope that that influences our colleagues. I think it's very important. We have so much knowledge, and of course we share it with our students, but we don't always share it with the wider reading public. And often, I feel, too often, the people who write history and who are seen as shaping our national historical narratives are by and large journalists. I have nothing against journalists. I read their work. They write beautifully, and often they do incredible research, but they don't always have that kind of broader perspective, the deeper perspective, the historical, transnational perspective that we have. So if anything, I would hope that it would encourage my colleagues to write more for a wider public, including you.
Yeah, no, I think that's incredibly important. And I think it's really one of our, it's really one of our missions here at the Grant Centers. We want to be able to connect our scholarship to a wider audience. I think that's really important. We have another question. Do you see the increase in the representation of Jewish women in TV and film, Marvelous Mrs. Maisel and Unorthodox, as a positive development in telling the history of Jewish women?
It certainly is. Mrs. Maisel got some details wrong when they're at the camp, and the loudspeaker, they're yelling for Avi. It's the 1950s, and they're yelling for Avi. There's not an American Jewish boy. It was named Avi in the 1950s. But I do think that it's a positive development, but you have to remember there's a long history. I mean, this is the cultural piece that I didn't touch in the book. There's a long history of Jewish women being influential in popular culture on the large screen and the small screen. So you can go back to Sophie Tucker, Gertrude Berg, and the Molly Goldberg show, which I did talk about a little bit, but because of how it shaped what was going on in the home. And Jewish women on screen, Mrs. Maisel, it's not new at all. I mean, there were periods when they weren't there, but by and large, there's this long thread of representations of Jewish women on stage and screen. And the big issue is whether or not they're positive portrayals or they're negative portrayals. I think the Mrs. Maisel portrayal is quite positive.
Great, thank you. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I really want to thank you, Pam, for a really wonderful talk. It was so great to have you. I say here in air quotes, but we're doing our best with the Zoom format, and I know we would all love to see you in person, but this was a fantastic way to get to see you and hear about your work nonetheless. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. My pleasure. Bye, everybody.